Thanks very much for including me on this panel. Let me begin by saying this is a fascinating and a meticulously researched report. I wrote a book, Ivory Towers on Sand, The Failure of Middle Eastern Studies 20 years ago, based on the 1990s, 80s, and 90s. This paper, I think, is an important update. And the overview of hard data about Middle East centers between 2000 and the present is really invaluable. Overall, the picture isn't pretty, but that is not a surprise. Because the recommendations have to do with funding, I want to say something about what the findings of this new study suggest to me. And to anticipate my own conclusion, the problem in Middle Eastern studies, including the centers, can't be fixed by more transparency or oversight of the funding because the problem is baked into the culture. Now, to begin, let's go back. The first thing to remember about Middle East centers and area studies centers more generally is that they were invented to be money machines. In the 1950s, the Soviets were pouring resources into contested world regions. And if we wanted to counter them, we had to get under the skins of people who spoke strange languages and professed strange religions and had strange customs. So we had to create experts. And that's what animated the Ford and the Rockefeller and the Carnegie Foundations, and ultimately the US government. So from the get-go, the measure of success or failure of the centers was their ability to attract money. And to get that money, they had to check three boxes. First, they had to have a strong core faculty built on their own resources. Second, they had to grant PhDs in a range of disciplines. And third, they had to teach all the relevant languages. And if you could check these three boxes, you could manufacture experts with advanced degrees and you could get your handout. Not that it was steady. I mean, the financial history of Middle East centers is a story of boom and bust. Sometimes the reasons have been economic and other times political. When the Title VI federal money has flowed, the centers have prospered. When it's stopped, they've languished. And those who couldn't get enough US government funding often turned to the rich Middle Eastern governments. The first heyday of foreign funding came back in the 70s and the 80s when the price of oil skyrocketed. There was an oil embargo, and the oil exporters worried over their portrayal as price gougers. So they funded Arab studies programs at Georgetown and at Harvard, even at Berkeley. It wasn't much compared to what they recycled to Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin, but it gave them an amen corner. And the message of these programs was basically this: it's the Arabs who've been the victims, so America owes them. Now, when I wrote Ivory Towers 20 plus years ago, US government and foreign funding had been through a couple of these boom and bust cycles, but they'd stabilized. And then came 9/11. At the time, I became a Mephisto when I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal warning the US government not to put another penny into Middle Eastern studies. But my piece had no effect on George W. Bush. Thanks to 9/11, he became the greatest patron Middle Eastern studies ever had. And as this report points out, and you have some charts there, government funding for Middle Eastern studies hit an all-time record during his administration. And this was accompanied by a wave of funding by Arab governments and individuals fronting for Arab governments. This time around, Arab states were alarmed by the charges that they turned a blind eye to extremists and terrorists. So they funded academics whose main assignment was to stigmatize any such suggestion as Islamophobia. Now we're in another phase, the result of two shifts in the 2010s. First, America, having rushed into the Middle East after 9/11, then left it in disappointment. And this unfolded simultaneous to the Great Recession and the 2013 budget sequestration. So as a result, the US government funding of area studies has tumbled. On Barack Obama's watch, Middle Eastern studies lost much of the Bush windfall. So the Title VI grants haven't kept up. This report has a chart that shows the size of the average annual grant to a Middle East center. It is now where it was, or lower than it was, in the year 2000. It's maybe $260,000 a year. Well, inflation over the same 2 decades has been close to 80%. The Title VI package then is worth about half of what it once bought for a Middle East center. So where does the difference come from? It doesn't come from Arab sources. This study doesn't show any big Arab gifts in the last decade, and for a reason. Arab governments found a better way to burnish their images. Instead of giving to academic Middle Eastern studies, they started to give to Washington think tanks. Now, as I showed in my book, in the 1980s, 1990s, the think tanks surpassed the universities as go-to sources of expertise for the media and the government. And by the 2000s, Arab governments had figured this out and started spreading their money there. I mean, they'd always had lobbyists and attorneys in Washington, but these had to register as foreign agents. It's much easier to establish a program in a think tank, a respected institution, has high visibility, enjoys the same tax status as a university, and has no requirement for disclosure. So I'm not going to list the names, but some think tanks might as well fly the flags of the United Arab Emirates or Qatar. So who makes up the shortfall in Academe? The universities themselves, the Ivy League institutions, and the flagship public universities, which host nearly all of the centers, are flush with money. In the prestigious ones, the general endowments grew massively over the past 2 decades. From 2000 to 2020, Harvard's endowment has grown by 122%, Columbia's by 164%, Princeton's by 208%, Yale's by 209%, Penn's by 304%. At the same time, the tuition and fees have skyrocketed. Over the last 20 years, at national private universities, they've grown by 134%, and at national public universities by 175% for the in-state students. When I wrote Ivory Towers, the privates on average charged $19,000. Now they charge more than $44,000. So what is $260,000 a year for any of these institutions? They can fund their own centers out of pocket change. In fact, in recent years, several Ivy League institutions have lost their Title VI funding for their Middle East centers, money that they had for 50 years. And they didn't bat an eye. And that includes one of your case studies, Harvard, as well as Princeton. Now, remember too that outside the centers and across America, Middle Eastern studies have never had significant external funding. These universities and colleges have maybe a handful of professors who teach about the Middle East. They're usually scattered among departments. In such places, Middle Eastern studies are funded primarily by tuition-paying students and their parents, and maybe by state legislatures. It's the professors from these lesser places who make up the bulk of the membership of MESA, the Middle East Studies Association. So in sum, today, the major source of funding for Middle Eastern studies and even Middle East centers isn't governments, US or foreign. And that brings me to my concluding insight. Many of you will have noticed that earlier this year, the members of MESA, Middle East Studies Association, passed a resolution endorsing the academic boycott of Israel. That proposal had been on the agenda for years and had never gotten across the finish line. This, despite the fact that MESA's members they had itched to condemn Israel in a public way. So what changed? Among other factors, the money factor. Some of the weightiest opponents of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, in MESA were the leaders of major Middle East centers. Some of them personally supported BDS, but they thought that if MESA endorsed it, it could endanger their Title VI funding. And as recently as 2015, in MESA's own deliberations, we have a record of them, these people argued against BDS when it came up for discussion. But today, US government funding is so negligible in relative terms that the money argument no longer holds much water. Even if US government funding were to disappear, it wouldn't matter as much as it did 10 or 20 years ago. So why sweat it? Just follow your prejudice and endorse BDS. If Middle East centers were really worried about their federal subsidies, they would have left MESA last March when the BDS resolution carried, and a few did, but most didn't. Of the 6 case studies in this report, 4 centers remain institutional members of the Middle East Studies Association. That's Harvard, Georgetown, Texas at Austin, and Duke through the North Carolina Consortium. Now, the MESA resolution also shows an indifference to losing Arab money. Remember that the trend in the rich Arab states is to normalize relations with Israel. The Abraham Accords are the opposite of BDS. So the Masons are basically flipping the middle finger to the rich Arab normalizers who have no problem cooperating with Israeli universities. So I submit Mesa can afford to endorse BDS, partly because Arab governments have largely stopped funding Middle Eastern studies anyway. Their money is in the think tanks, which do support Arab state policies of peace and normalization. So the result is this Middle East studies paradox. It's a case of self-sustaining radicalization that not only doesn't depend on outside funding, but actually deepens in its absence. It's the general woke climate in the academy that nurtures the worst in Middle Eastern studies. And it's the internal resources of the universities and colleges that pay for nearly all of it. So while I'm impressed by the thoroughness of this report, I don't think we can know what effect its main recommendation would have were it implemented. So the 5 recommendations that Neeta made, only one isn't about transparency, and it's this, and I quote it, the federal government should consider withdrawing financial support for national resource centers. Now, do we think that this would moderate Middle Eastern studies? Probably not. Do we think this would shut the centers down? Probably not. So just what would it do? My own view today is that there's no way to reform Middle Eastern studies by pulling the purse strings. And there's no need. The Mesa crowd are doing a perfectly good job destroying their credibility and relevance on their own. The way forward is to create alternatives. There's an alternative to Mesa. It's called ASMEA. And there should be alternatives to the existing Middle East centers. If there's political and financial capital out there for change, I think that that's where it should go. So I've said enough.